On.
Like a second language.
Okay, so this section is setting up a KPI framework, which is a really important part of the job. And I'll hand over to Brian to take us through this.
Thanks, Julian. And yeah, this is usually the caboose of the process, which is a shame because when you get down to delivering your campaign or your creative and you need to go back to your clients, this is really critical for that step in showing whether it was effective or not. So we're going to walk through step by step how to set up a KPI framework, key performance indicators, if we're not all aware of what KPI is. So it's really important to start with business objectives. So there's start with where you want to drive your business. The first point is that it needs to be financially led. You want to prioritize profit or sales or some kind of financial growth above all else. Fame, awareness, anything like that is all in the means to grow a business. Unfortunately, we live in a capitalist economy. That's the service that we provide. The second is SMART. This is really nothing to do with advertising. This is just a general thing that you want to do when you set up objectives. They should be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. So those ones that are like, we want to be really cool or buzzy, those are not super great because they're pretty hard to measure. And then finally, you want to prioritize them. Business measures are the most important. Then you have other types of measures, but even within business measures, you want to prioritize them because sometimes you might have a business goal of market share and then sales. Market share might be your more important objective. So those are three principles to keep in mind. We have an example to walk you through as we go through setting up KPI framework to kind of bring it to life because these do kind of get a little abstract. We're going to use everyone's favorite Quaker, this lovely gentleman with that. So we'll use Quaker oatmeal as a case study. So the oatmeal category, and this is somewhat true, is declining. It's a pretty old part of the breakfast space category. The brand itself is a 140-year-old brand, and they really wanted to combat declines. So they believe that they have to reposition their brands to contemporize and recruit a new generation of breakfast believers. So this is really kind of what the clients would bring to us. But when you get down into actually defining that and coming up with what your business and communications measures are, it's really important to separate those two out because what I said before was prioritize business measures, start with those. So we'll start with the business measures in the situation in the client brief. The goal being to grow profits by stealing back market share from newer invader brands and becoming the leading cereal brand in the US. So you can see that in there, those are largely financially business growth, brand growth driven. The communications objective in comparison is much more about perception and would lead into the business objective. The goal being to grow top of mind awareness, the level of leading cereal brands by creating a deeper emotional connection with consumers. So this is something that you would hopefully get from clients or get to with clients in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. Sometimes the communication objective is developed by the agency or by the consultant after the fact, but these are the 2 points that you should really be walking into the situation with. The second point in this process is determine what stimulus you're testing. So when we talk about measuring advertising, there are a number of different elements of an advertising campaign or brand that you can test. And each one has its own purpose or benefit or role in understanding the efficacy of a campaign or brand. So if you go to the next slide, there are largely 4 elements. You have your brand. So that could be a brand kind of business value proposition. It could be something about the tone, personality, something about what the creative elements are. We could get down to the next level, which is a concept. This could be a higher level concept that stretches a brand across several years. That's larger than a campaign. Maybe it's something that the brand stands for a long time. In that place, you can test manifestos, taglines, key visuals. Then when you get down into the campaign level, you start looking at different kind of more executional parts of what you're putting into the market. So you can measure your media mix, your messaging mix, and your different formats. And then you get down to the real nitty gritty. You can actually measure your ads. And this is probably what we're most familiar with the exception of maybe brand. I think that's a pretty common form of measuring stimulus. That's where you're measuring storyboards, finished products, messaging, creative techniques, basically any kind of ad format that you could find out there. So it's important to understand what you're measuring and what you're putting into this kind of KPI framework. The third step is understanding your desired business effects. So here we had sort of, in the prior example with Quaker, we had a couple of phrases in there. What you want to do with that phrase and that business goal is really start to pull out what are these effects, what are these KPIs that you as a brand or you as an agency need to push on. And really there are 7 universal business effects that are good to look at. There are a lot of nuances to these. There are much more complex versions of these business effects that exist out in the world that have been created by proprietary systems. These are the universal ones. Sales, this is really just straight sales. How much money are you getting in from selling your products? Loyalty is really a measure of how loyal or how many times people repeat purchase. And then rate of purchase is kind of tied to loyalty. So if you see a high rate of purchase, there's usually a high rate of loyalty, or at least that's the assumption. Price sensitivity, that's the amount that people are willing to pay for your product. Penetration, how many people are buying your product. Market share, how much of your market you own. So it might be a different size than how many people are buying. So penetration and market share are different. And then finally, profit. So that's obviously all the money coming in minus your expenses. And these all have different elements, and they're dynamic in different ways. And you really need to look at what that initial business push is, pull that apart, and pull out what business effects you're trying to drive on. Really quick point, if you look at some of the studies on the previous slide, in general, sales has the lowest correlation with growth, because you can drive a lot of sales in a short time period, spend a lot of money, but not really grow your business. Profit has the highest correlation with growth, because profit is in another way a form of growth. So not to say that sales are irrelevant, but that's just something to keep in mind when looking at these business effects. And then on the next slide, in terms of choosing the right business effects, this is a very nuanced decision that you want to make, in partnership with, hopefully, if you're working with a client or some other people in a team. But in general, there are a few rules of thumb that you can look at, rule of thumbs, you can look at to kind of jump to where you should be measuring. So you can kind of look at it as by defined as who you're trying to reach and what you're trying to get them to do. So if your target is anyone and your goal is to grow the business, you just want to look at profit. That's just the straightforward goal. There's no other input in your client brief that you've seen other than I want to grow business. If your target is anyone and you want to increase quality perception, price sensitivity is a good thing to look at, because quality perception is linked to price sensitivity. The more quality consumers perceive in your brand or product, the more they're willing to pay for the most part. But then you can start to look down into when you speak to different audiences. So if you're looking to speak to existing buyers, are you trying to get them to buy more or to create new forms of usage? Or are you trying to reinforce existing behavior? That's where you want to maybe look at rate of purchase and perhaps loyalty as a secondary metric. If you're looking at rate of purchase, it's not just about existing customers, it's also people that aren't buying. Are they buying more and how much? And then when you're talking to new buyers, if you're trying to drive trial or generate new buyer consideration, that's where you want to start to look at things like market share and penetration, how many people you're bringing into the category. So that's a very loose level, high level look at picking these out. Obviously, it's much more involved when you get down into the certain business situation. So we're going to come back to our lovely Quaker example and start to build out these business measures. So we already went over the business objective on that previous slide. It was sort of a little bit of a punchy statement of growing profits by stealing back share from newer invader brands and becoming the leader cereal brand in the US. We also have been given a little bit of background knowledge from the clients. And what the process is in the middle of this is starting to pull out what they're asking for in the initial business objective, combining that with the background knowledge around how much market share Quaker has at this point in time, how much penetration they have at that point in time, and then choosing your specific KPIs to prioritize as business measures. So we know that Quaker wants to grow profits. That's the first thing on their list of business objectives. And we look down at sort of the levels that we're at. We feel like given the resources that we have, the media plan that we have, it's reasonable to grow profits by 2%. They also wanted to kind of steal market share back. So we want to increase our market share, again, by looking at the state of the brand, what we can invest, what we can realistically expect people to come in. We want to increase that share by six points. And market share is not the same as penetration, so we also want to look at penetration, how many people are coming into the brands from within the category. again, given what we know about current levels of penetration, what the client's looking for in that level of priority, we say, let's increase penetration by 4%. And already we're starting out with a really clear set of business measures with smart, measurable numbers attached to them that we can go back to and stay accountable with the clients.
Brian, can you explain the difference here you were saying between market share and penetration and how they're not the same things? Could you explain that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So market share is a measure of how much of a product or money a brand takes up within a market. So are you selling 50 of the 100 bikes that exist in the market? That's product. Are you selling? And then the money part is how much profit are you making from this category? And that's not always reflective of the audience or the penetration, because you could have some people buying a lot. So you can have a very high share of market, but low penetration, for whatever reason. Maybe you have a very strong loyalty program. For the most part, penetration and market share they go hand in hand, because it depends on the category, but for the most part, people are buying around the same rate. You might have some loyal and things like that, but they're pretty closely correlated. It's when you start to look at if it's repeat purchase or kind of different behaviors of purchase. Bulk purchasing is also something that you find in fast-moving consumer goods. You might have people buying a huge amount of it at one time, and that really takes up a big part of your share. So they're close, but they should be distinguished, because it really reflects, the market share reflects a bigger impact than just how many people. Are they also buying more? Are you taking a bigger bite of the overall market with that? Because you might have people come in and buy less. It's very, very nuanced, but great question, Julian. Great. So we've talked about business effects. Those are the North Star. They should always be the North Star for any kind of KPI framework. From there, we move down into communications effects. And the thinking here, whether it's really, whatever school of thought you come from, you use communications to affect business effects. You use communications to change behavior. So the next layer down is really to understand what your desired communications effects are. We talked in the first section of the advertising effectiveness, the 2 schools of thought that Julian took you through. If you want to look at what your communication effectiveness KPIs are, a good way to look at that is according to each school of thought. So the AIDA school of thought is really this idea of rational path to purchase. You see something or you want something, you think about it. If you feel good about it, then you do it. The other idea is, or model or belief, is dual process, and that's that non-cognitive emotional path of purchase. And that's sort of flipping it on its head, where you feel something, maybe you feel like you want to be have experience with a brand, then you think about it. It's the low effort on the thinking part, and then you do it. It really depends on where your organization and brand is with their belief system. They both have their merits. I think there's a lot more value in what we're seeing in research coming across the dual process. But that's a good framework to start with. And then if we start to fill in the KPIs on the next slide, you can start to see what some of those would be. So, at a really high level, if you break apart these 2 schools of thought, for the big communication effects that you can drive with the AIDA school is awareness, comprehension. So that's really familiarity with your brands. So there are a lot of tests around, do you know this about the brand? How well do you know the brand? It's sort of related to the distinct asset test. Are you familiar with this aspect of the brand or this product? Interest is the next level down, where you'll start to gauge, would you want to purchase this? Are you interested in this product? And the desire is basically just the point before purchase if they're going to go in and act. And then when we look at the dual process, they're pretty different. It's much less deliberate, and it's much more intuitive. Emotion is a big one. How do you feel about the brand when you see it? And that is a form of measurement that's new, but emerging more and more. Fluency, we talked in the earlier section about, distinct assets. That the distinct assets of a brand really come into play in the fluency here. How familiar people are with your colors, logos, sounds. And then salience, which is that mental share section that reference again with mental and physical availability. Another way of saying mental availability, how salient are you in people's minds, or how salient does this trigger make the brand in people's minds? That's a good place to start out at the high level, but from there you can really start to drill down into much more detailed and much more specific metrics. But if we wanted to plot these 2 schools of thoughts and the larger kind of effects that you can measure across them, modern literature will tell you that the dual systems KPIs and effects have a higher correlation with growth. Emotion, the fluency of a person with a brand, and how salient it is in their minds. Research is saying that this is much closer tied to business effects than what we've seen in the past with high awareness or top of mind awareness. There's even a company called System One that is wholly dedicated to measuring that first bucket of the dual systems process, where they look at facial expressions, and there are a few kind of implicit survey questions where they're almost entirely looking to get people's emotional reaction to a brand, and they're almost entirely disregarding any kind of rational takeaway. Fluency measures are out there as well, but what you can really start to drill down into, I think this is exciting, maybe not exciting, it depends on your point of view. You can start to drill down into the layer below these and get into much more nuanced versions of these KPIs. And, they all have their trade-offs. I don't think we want to read through all of these, but awareness is one big bucket, but you can really start to drill those down into different forms of awareness. So top of mind awareness is really kind of close to salience. Then you have ad recognition and ad recall, and these all are different ways of measuring these higher level concepts, because it's not perfectly organized. We tried to make it this way, but this is a good reference for going back to and pulling out those kind of smaller pieces. And then I think this is a good description of the two schools of thought, again, just to kind of recap the different communications effects and how they operate. That ADA format and the effects, or the ADA model and the effects that are coming out of awareness, comprehension, desire, and interest. That's really that explicit path to purchase. And then you have your dual process. It's really that implicit path to purchase. And then we have sort of, a few different ways of thinking about how you might be able to translate old school metrics or old school way of thinking into new school way of thinking. So I don't know if anyone who's been in this business for the last at least 5 to 10 years has probably worked with an advertiser who has some old school metrics. And you need to you can't just throw them out the window. You need to hear them out. A lot of the times these brands have invested in these metrics of awareness. They have years of data saying top of mind awareness. So it's really important to not just toss them out the window and be mindful of what you're suggesting and what works. I think my rule of thumb is an and is always good. You can still look at the old stuff and continue to look at the new stuff without throwing it out the window. But, just a few different kind of things, in terms of like how you can translate this, like top of mind awareness is really kind of parallel to salience. Comprehension is really kind of, an overly rational way of thinking of implicit attributions. They might be associating you with certain things. They might not comprehend that your motor works 3 times harder, but maybe they implicitly associate you with tougher. And that's kind of the pivot that you want to make. And I think that's also, we've talked in talking to clients about distinct assets, they have really kind of gravitated towards that, because I think there's some holdover of what they used to measure that they can then carry over in terms of implicit associations in these spaces. And then when you start to get down into intent and desire, really emotion drives it there. So this takes it down to the next layer for Quaker, where we start to build out what the communication objectives are, similar to what we did with the business objectives. For comms objectives here, we look at what did the client ask us to do, and then we try to understand what the current situation is. So that's the background knowledge. So from the background knowledge, we know that top of mind awareness around key moments is around 15%. And in order to get back to their levels of market share that they want, they need to get that back up to 25%. This is based on research they've seen, marketing mix model data, where they know that this level of awareness drives this level of market share. So we take into account those different inputs and develop those different communications methods at the bottom. So top of mind awareness, emotional response, etc.
Sorry, I was controlling the slides there and just slipping about a little bit on you there, mate. So sorry about that. But I think this section is so good, because I think everyone kind of thinks of KPIs. And the big thing for me is that you often just merge, comms and business together, and then it feels like a bit of a soup. Where I think what's great about this is it's clear delineation. These are what business is. This is what comms is, and you've shown the correlation to business success. So, thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. Sorry about my sloppy work on the.
I love nerding out on this stuff. It's great.
Awesome.